Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also syndicated on WHIV New Orleans. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. This week, we are going to cover the kind of ongoing situation with regard to what appears to be a U.S. military buildup in Iran, as well as the kind of increased sanctions that have been hitting Iran, as well as the many other countries that are currently being targeted with U.S. sanctions. It appears that John Bolton at kind of the moment is driving foreign policy. So we're going to talk about all the implications of that within Iran, what's really kind of going on with the so-called escalated tensions there. And we are also probably going to get into Venezuela, maybe some other kind of related topics to kind of U.S. war and empire, all that good stuff. So for the next, for this segment, we are joined by Ben Norton. He's a journalist, a reporter for The Gray Zone, and the producer of Moderate Rebels podcast, which he co-hosts with Max Blumenthal. Thank you very much, Ben, for coming on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very glad to have you. So I'm wondering if we can sort of break down this what's going on in Iran. I've covered Iran a few times before, but it'll be nice to sort of get into what exactly is going on. So like the Trump administration, I don't know, is about a week or two ago. Started really kind of ratcheting up tensions with Iran based on some sort of a supposed Iranian, escalated Iranian threat. To my knowledge, they've yet to kind of clarify what exactly that threat is all about. They've neither clarified nor quantified what this supposed escalated threat from Iran is. So kind of where are we with all this? What is really going on here?
Well, of course, this began several weeks ago. It's May 28th now. And the original claim, the only real substantial claim, although it's completely baseless, but in terms of the actual accusation, was that Iran was supposedly implicated in an attack on Saudi oil tankers. And of course, this is ridiculous, but this was the pretext used to justify U.S. further military aggression against Iran. Although we need to make it clear that this is not new. There has been a ratcheting up, and it is significant. But this has been going on for many years. Of course, we can really go back to the second Bush administration, George W. Bush, and the beginning of the so-called War on Terror, where Bush declares the axis of evil. And John Bolton, who is now Trump's national security advisor, was, of course, deeply involved in the Bush administration's declaration of this axis of evil. And, of course, one of the architects of the illegal 2003 invasion of Iraq. So the pretext they're using is that in the beginning of this month, around May 12th or 13th, there was an attack on Saudi oil tankers. But as you've mentioned, since then, the Trump administration and anonymous U.S. government officials and a compliant corporate media that simply echoes what these U.S. government operatives say without any evidence have been repeating that Iran is threatening U.S. interests in the region. Now, they leave this purposely ambiguous. This language is extremely ambiguous because, of course, then that gives them leeway to justify any form of aggression that they're planning. So John Bolton has even extended it so far as to say that Iran is threatening the interests of the United States and its allies. And that's why the U.S. just has to now we're sending 1,500 troops. And the U.S. is also sending planes and aircraft carrier. So we can talk more about the specific details. But of course, the point you just made is the key point, that this is left purposefully vague because they're using it just to justify, they're using this fake pretense to justify this aggression that the Trump administration, and specifically characters like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, wanted to carry out in the first place. And they were looking for some kind of convenient excuse. And this attack on the Saudi oil tankers, which was probably carried out by Yemen's Houthi movement, Ansar Allah, not Iran, was used as the beginning pretext to justify it.
I think you kind of bringing up the axis of evil might be a little off topic, because I would say that, we're in a much different era now. We have the troika of tyranny. But seriously, though, it's very much like we're just reliving kind of the Bush administration in so many ways. And one of my criticisms, among many criticisms of kind of the corporate media and just the kind of discourse around Trump and Trumpism, is that much like George Bush, but even more so, everything is sort of laid to blame on him without the kind of realization of how like these systemic systems of power work, and these kind of networks of people like John Bolton, for instance, are essentially able to kind of steer foreign policy in this direction. So another thing I'm also kind of curious about with regard to the so-called quote unquote Iranian influence in the Middle East, that's also always left purposely vague. But we hear, for instance, everything from the Houthis to Hezbollah to basically any kind of force within the region that's not aligned with, again, quote unquote, U.S. interests, whatever horrifying things U.S. interests might be in the region. But anything that doesn't seem to be aligned to those interests is considered essentially to be a proxy of Iran in ways that I really don't think gets at kind of the heart of kind of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Maybe you can sort of elaborate on that and just, how how the U.S. has kind of built that narrative.
Absolutely. First of all, we need to understand that this is bipartisan. And there's been a lot of discussion of the Iran nuclear deal, and we would be remiss if we didn't discuss that. So really quickly, I'll just mention that it's true that the Obama administration did pass this historic, important agreement, and that was a move toward rapprochement with Iran, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And Trump blatantly violated unilaterally this agreement, withdrew the U.S. from it. This was an international agreement that was negotiated over a period of several years. And although if you listen to the U.S. corporate media, you would think that it's only between the U.S. and Iran, in fact, it's an international agreement between the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So that includes not just the U.S., but also Britain, France, China, and Russia. So some of the largest and most powerful countries in the world. And in addition to that, Germany was a signatory to the agreement, and the European Union. All of those other countries have continued abiding by this agreement. Only the U.S. has withdrawn from this agreement. Now, this is an egregious, blatantly illegal violation. The UN Security Council, again, endorsed this. So the fact that the U.S. has torn up this agreement is a violation of a UN Security Council resolution and blatantly illegal. So that is an extreme form of aggression. But that is an important preface that I mentioned. In the Obama administration, it's true they did negotiate that. But in 2010, the Obama White House is what initially passed the extremely aggressive sanctions on Iran. Now, to be fair, those sanctions did really begin under George Bush, and we were talking about the axis of evil. But as we've seen with Venezuela now, where Obama began the sanctions, which were then grossly expanded by Trump, similarly, the sanctions on Iran, the main ones began under Bush and were grossly expanded by Obama. And Obama expanded them from the Bush sanctions, which were mostly based on they were targeting the assets of government officials who were linked to Iran's nuclear power program. Iran never had a nuclear weapons program. That needs to be cleared, although the corporate media frequently says this lie. So it was still ridiculous. It was still illegal. It was still an aggressive action. But the Bush administration sanctions were targeted. And then the Obama administration passed these crippling economic sanctions, preventing Iran from importing and exporting goods, including things like rugs, pistachios. I mean, they were ridiculous draconian sanctions. And then, of course, the Obama administration used those sanctions as a form of leverage to pressure Iran to negotiate. So even though the JCPOA was an important diplomatic breakthrough, there's still not the adequate context. Liberals, at least the few remaining anti-war liberals, there aren't that many anymore, but they'll portray the Obama administration's JCPOA as some kind of peace attempt. But actually, again, it was the Obama administration that put the sanctions on Iran in the first place in order to force Iran to sign that agreement. So similarly, I think we're seeing that policy on steroids now, where the Trump administration has blatantly violated this agreement and is now threatening war and sending troops and planes in this extremely aggressive action. And as we've just been discussing, the idea is that Iran is threatening U.S. interests. Now, what does that mean? First of all, the U.S. is on the other side of the world. There's a giant ocean between the Middle East and the U.S. But of course, this is the hubris of American imperialism. The U.S. believes it controls the entire world, and Iran, which is very much located in the Middle East, the last time I looked at a map, Iran has interests, of course, in the region. And just because Iran does things outside of its borders doesn't mean that that is a form of aggression. There's a difference between imperialism, which is what the U.S. is doing, and foreign policy. Every country has a foreign policy. Every country is part of the international community and has to do actions outside of its borders. But we can talk more about that. But I'll let you jump back in. But I just wanted to stress the historical context there, because we can't have a discussion about what's going on right now without understanding that recent historical context. I mean, of course, we'd have to even go back even further to 1953, when the CIA overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who is secular, left-wing, a Republican. He was overthrown on behalf of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which became British Petroleum. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that from the 1953 coup up until 1979, the U.S. and Britain staunchly supported the brutal authoritarian absolute monarchy of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi. So all that context is important. But really, if we want to understand what the Trump administration is doing, the point I was making with Obama is that it's not that different from what Obama was doing and what Bush was doing. The difference is that the media, the corporate media, was when it wasn't opposing the JCPOA at first, when it did pass, they kind of rewrote the history of the Obama years and portrayed it as if Obama was a dove who was doing this out of the kindness of its heart, and not the fact that this was realpolitik, which is something we're seeing again right now.
I also like to kind of point out, just in terms of where is the U.S. located. Again, I'm not a kind of master geographer, but my understanding is that the U.S. is not on the same continent as the Middle East, and therefore, again, what are kind of U.S. interests there? But then I remember a little while back, and this is a little tangential, but seeing a Reuters investigative piece. It was like a 5-piece investigation on China's growing influence. But this is the kind of headline that really, really kind of got me and kind of shows just the audacity, the hubris of kind of the U.S. The headline goes, China's vast fleet is tipping the balance in the Pacific, with the kind of subtitle, the Chinese Navy, which is growing faster than any other major fleet, now controls the seas off its coast. Once dominant, the United States and its allies sail warily in these waters. A former U.S. naval officer says China's advances have caught America napping. But that key line, my God, the Chinese Navy now controls the seas off its coast. Right. It's right there. It's just like the sheer audacity of that to me. And we see a similar thing whenever Iran, for instance, has ships within the Persian Gulf, the Gulf that is named after them. I know there's also been kind of U.S. attempts to kind of rebrand that. It's amazing that they can rebrand seas, but trying to rebrand that as the kind of Gulf of Arabia or whatnot. I think that's kind of a nod to Saudi Arabia. The whole kind of audacity of the U.S. kind of believing that they have or should have complete superiority. And this kind of learned amnesia with people with regard to again, something like the kind of U.S. buildup and these kind of general, I don't want to use the word false flag, but yeah, I mean, we saw, for instance, like the Gulf of Tonkin. We've seen the Maine, the Lusitania. We've seen these kind of pretenses before in a way that always just kind of leads to always leads to the U.S. doing exactly what it wants, claiming the defense, but always kind of going on the offense for countries that, again, have not attacked anybody. Iran, to my knowledge, hasn't invaded any other country in hundreds of years. Yeah, I'm wondering if we can kind of get into whether you think this is likely to kind of lead to a war or lead to, beyond simply the escalation, the ratcheting up of tensions. You said you don't think, when we were kind of discussing this segment, you said you don't think that necessarily this might actually be the kind of launch of the war itself, but is simply a sort of a kind of pretense to normalize, again, these kind of more ratchet up sanctions and the kind of heightened pressure, that like the pressure itself might be the end goal, more so than the actual invasion, because I think an invasion of Iran would not even go the same way as the invasion of Iraq.
Absolutely. A few different things. One, I want to briefly talk about what you discussed, this attempt to rebrand the Persian Gulf as the Arab Gulf. We've seen Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, the neoliberal magazine that just hired Rahm Emanuel as a columnist, and Jeffrey Goldberg, who was previously a prison guard in Israel for the IDF, he has been attempting to rebrand it as the Arab Gulf, using it in his articles and using it in The Atlantic. And of course, as you mentioned, this is an attempt to erase the history of Iran and really just erase Iran from the region and portray everything as if it belongs to U.S. proxies like Saudi Arabia. So that's a very clear, concerted attempt, and that's kind of a cultural, historical war on Iran. And of course, you were just discussing the thing about the word false flag is I think it's overused a lot, but at the same time, we should be, very clear. There are many documented false flags in not just U.S. history, but in other countries' history. This is extremely well documented.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the Gulf of Tonkin. Gulf of Tonkin is a very well documented false flag operation. Even more egregious is that the Pentagon and the CIA had plans for what's known as Operation Northwoods, which was a false flag operation they were considering against Cuba. They were planning on attacking boats of Cuban refugees and then blaming it on the Cuban government, using it as some kind of justification to launch an invasion of Cuba. And I need to, stress that the U.S. did illegally invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs. And of course, the U.S. has blockaded Cuba illegally in violation of international law now since 1961. And every single year at the General Assembly, meaning in the United Nations, every single year, every country in the world except Israel votes against the unilateral U.S. sanctions against Cuba. So what we're seeing with Iran is something very similar. And I would not, without a doubt, I would not rule out the possibility of U.S. false flag attacks against Iran. Now, I'm not saying that every attack is a false flag. I don't think these domestic shootings by fascists here in the U.S. are false flags like Alex Jones. That's ridiculous. But the point is that it's not a conspiracy, an insane conspiracy theory to point out that there have been documented U.S. government false flag attacks. This is in declassified U.S. government documents. And with a country like Iran, there certainly has been discussion of these kinds of things. Now, the attack on the oil tankers, I don't think that was a false flag attack. I don't think Iran had anything to do with it. In fact, we know who took credit for the attacks on the Saudi oil tankers, the Houthis in Yemen. And this goes back to something you were alluding at earlier about the Houthis and Hezbollah. There's been this extremely lazy, racist attempt by the Western corporate media and Western governments to portray all resistance forces in the Middle East as if they're just puppets and lackeys of the Iranians, as if, what's so funny is that this agency argument was co-opted by regime change advocates in Syria. They're like, you're violating the agency of people who were armed and trained and funded by the CIA and by Saudi Arabia. But in that case, they can actually talk about agency, but they never talk about the agency of people in Yemen or in Lebanon who, in the case of Lebanon, were suffering under years of illegal Israeli military occupation of their country, and they picked up weapons and fought legally under international law in self-defense against the illegal occupation of their country by Israel, and of course led to the creation of groups like Hezbollah. which is not a terrorist organization, which does not target civilian targets, which only targets military targets, unlike the forces the US has supported and armed, these Salafi jihadi groups who bomb Shia mosques and kill women and children. And then, of course, we can talk about the Houthis in Yemen, which have a similar history. These are indigenous groups, both Hezbollah and the Houthis, that are basically kind of nationalist groups. If this were the 1960s, I would think they would be anti-colonial nationalist groups. But for a variety of different geopolitical reasons today and the collapse of the socialist bloc, they're more Shia-oriented Islamist liberation groups, but they're nationalist groups. In the case of Hezbollah, which operates with Sunni and Christian groups inside the Lebanese government, this is a democratically elected party in the Lebanese government. It's a Lebanese organization, and yes, it receives support from Iran, but there are also groups that receive support from the U.S., but the American media don't refer to these groups as U.S. proxies. But every time we see a media report on Hezbollah, they're referred to as Iranian proxies. And even worse, every time we see reports on the Houthis, which have also an indigenous history inside Yemen going back to the 1990s, which began as a kind of cultural group and then became more politicized in response to the rise of Wahhabi influence from Saudi Arabia and the US, and then eventually began a guerrilla war, a liberation war against the government, which was backed by the US, and then successfully actually launched a revolution and overthrew that government. And the history of the Houthis is too long to go into here. But anyway, the point is that both of these groups have their own indigenous histories inside their respective countries. And yes, it's true that they are allied politically with Iran and might receive support from Iran, but they would exist without Iran. Iran is not what put them into being. The actual material conditions on the ground of violence, oppression, warfare, these are the issues that led to their creation. And of course, the attempt to portray them as Iranian proxies is an attempt to obfuscate those conditions, erase the forms of aggression carried out by the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, and portray all of this as just an Iranian plot. And the US has continued to do this for years. It began, as I mentioned, under Bush, and I just stress this again, it was continued under Obama, who's the one who oversaw the first 2 years of the war in Yemen with the fake pretext that this is a war, a proxy war against Iran, even though in reality the Obama administration launched the first 2 years of a genocidal war in Yemen. And this has all continued under Trump. And finally, I'll get to the point really quickly here. You asked about whether or not a war is possible. Now, I don't know how much time we have. I would like to talk more about what that could mean, but the quick answer to it is I don't think a war could be possible. It doesn't look likely specifically because, one, the Iranian government, regardless of what you think about it, and there's certainly a lot to criticize, but the Iranian people might have disagreements with some of the policies in terms of, labor rights, women's rights, theocracy. But if you look at polls, the vast majority of Iranians support their government's foreign policy and do not want their government overthrown. And if there were any operation, the vast majority of the population would unite in support of their government. And it's very different from Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which was still a criminal invasion, but the Iranian government is much more popular than the Iraqi government was, which was always, we don't have time to go into the historical context, but Saddam Hussein always ran it as a kind of small minority group of elites that were running the entire Iraqi government, whereas, again, regardless of what you think about the character of the Iranian government, there was a popular revolution in 1979 that overthrew a colonial puppet regime and installed an independent sovereign government. And Iranians greatly value that government and greatly value the independence of that government specifically. So there's that factor. And then there's the factor that even if the U.S. tried to, it would just be completely catastrophic. Because as I mentioned, even though they're not proxies of Iran, Iran has allies in the region, including the Iraqi government, including the Syrian government, including Lebanese Hezbollah, and including the Houthis in Yemen. So if the U.S. were to launch some kind of conventional war, it would become an international war that would not only draw in these other actors in the region, like we saw in Syria, but even worse on steroids, but even potentially actors outside of the Middle East like China and Russia, and we could have a global war in our hands. So the potential for this to spiral out of control into just a World War III is very real. And then there's simply the fact that Iran simply just has deterrence. They have a very powerful military. And one of the reasons I think the Trump administration is carrying out this aggressive policy, this blatantly illegal form of aggression, is because they're trying to pressure the Iranian government to spend more on its military and to do more missile tests, and then use the fact that Iran is boosting its defense and deterrence as another excuse to justify the U.S. arms race. And it's a kind of perpetual cycle that is meant to bankrupt Iran, because the illegal U.S. sanctions on Iran are already very much crippling the economy. Iran is really incapable now almost of exporting its oil, just like with Venezuela. This is suffocation of the Iranian economy. And it's all leading to this policy of regime change that the Trump administration is trying to pursue. But because of the deterrence capability, the U.S. can't carry out regime change directly. So they're just trying to suffocate the entire country, just like they're doing with Venezuela. This is collective punishment of the entire Iranian civilian population. It's preventing Iran from importing medicine and other surgical equipment and medical goods, which is leading to mass death, preventable death of people, of civilians. It's also preventing Iran from importing some food products and other equipment and goods. And it's simply a kind of medieval siege in the 21st century. And it's the same tactic against Venezuela. If you can't invade, threaten and impose economic warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is such a kind of clear connection between the U.S. policy toward Iran and Venezuela, as you were talking about. For those of you just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We are joined for this conversation by Ben Norton, who's a reporter for The Gray Zone, as well as the producer and a co-host of the Moderate Rebels podcast, which is co-hosted by Max Blumenthal. Another kind of key thing to mention here is just the connections between Iran and Venezuela, especially given what was it that Bolton was saying, that I think was a kind of making the ridiculous claim that like Hezbollah was active in Venezuela or something to that effect.
This is a right-wing conspiracy theory going back many years now. But the idea is that the leftist governments in Latin America during the time of the Pink Tide, which has largely been beaten back in a large part due to U.S. intervention in imperialism in the region. So we saw military coups in places like Honduras. We saw soft coups in Brazil. And of course, one of the few leftist governments left in the region is Venezuela. But this is not just for Venezuela. There have been Republicans who have claimed for years that Cuba, even Nicaragua, what you mentioned, the so-called the troika of tyranny, supposedly is supporting Hezbollah and allowing them to operate in the region. Now, this is, of course, preposterous. And all of these claims come from anonymous U.S. government officials. But the New York Times has now published at least 2 stories in the past few weeks with this blatantly ridiculous story based on claims from anonymous, unnamed U.S. government officials. And there's not much more to say other than this is just ridiculous and stupid. But it's part of this strategy going back to the lead up of the Iraq War, of course, where in order to justify the illegal forms of aggression that the U.S. is already carrying out, it has to create some kind of pretext. In the lead up to Iraq, a significant percentage of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein was linked to al-Qaeda, which is just outlandish, absurd, blatantly false. Now, the irony is that Saddam Hussein was in fact allied with the U.S. The U.S. the CIA supported the Iraqi Ba'athist coup, which was different from the Syrian Ba'athist coup. The Iraqi Ba'athists were the right wing of the Ba'athist movement, who were anti-communist. And Saddam Hussein proceeded to purge and kill all of the members of the Iraqi Communist Party with a list provided to him by the CIA. And then after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, in 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran and launched a brutal 8-year war that killed more than 1 million people, the Iran-Iraq War, in which the U.S. was openly supporting Saddam Hussein throughout that war, although the U.S., we found later, actually supported both sides. But the majority of the support went to Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And we know from declassified CIA documents that the U.S. was giving Iraq chemical weapons, and Britain as well, and then helping Iraq target Iranians, including Iranian civilians, with those chemical weapons. And then fast forward, of course, the invasion of Kuwait, which was also questionable, and then the U.S. involvement. And then finally, the U.S. uses the 9/11 attacks, which were carried out by al-Qaeda, which had no links to Iraq. And in fact, these al-Qaeda militants, these extremists, were actually linked back to the anti-Soviet war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, in which the CIA armed and trained al-Qaeda allies in Afghanistan. But the attempt was, of course, to link Saddam to these forces, which the U.S. was much more closely linked to, and then say that, oh, Saddam must be overthrown because he's linked to terrorism and has WMDs, blah, blah, blah. It's the same ridiculous tactics now that are being used against Venezuela and Iran, because there is no basis whatsoever in any way for the blatantly illegal forms of U.S. aggression against these countries. And regardless of the limitations, and there are certainly a lot of limitations to international law, the reason I keep stressing this is because the U.S. is just blatantly violating all of these international legal norms. There's no discussion whatsoever of that in the U.S. media because they're chauvinists and don't care about the rest of the world. But regardless of its limitations, this international law does exist, and it shows very clearly that Iran and Venezuela are abiding by international law, and they are the ones who are in fact being diplomatic, while the U.S. is once again showing itself to be the actual rogue state. And the same strategy is now being used because the U.S. recognizes Hezbollah as a supposed terrorist organization. Although, as I mentioned, according to any actual definition of terrorism that's a logical definition, they are decidedly not a terrorist organization, unless you also want to define the U.S. military as a terrorist organization, because like the U.S. military, Hezbollah is a military group that works with the Lebanese army. The Lebanese army has worked with Hezbollah to fight ISIS together because Hezbollah is seen as a legitimate military group inside Lebanon that defends Lebanon's territory, sovereign territory, from international aggression. But anyway, the U.S. considers Hezbollah a terrorist organization and then is trying to link the Maduro administration in Venezuela to so-called terrorism. And then the U.S. is going to say, oh, well, now we have to overthrow Maduro because he's supporting terrorism.
Yeah, it's
the same strategy used against Saddam Hussein.
And it's absolutely absurd because, again, much as the U.S. is not in the Middle East, and therefore doesn't really have any kind of legitimate interest with what's going on in the Middle East, Venezuela is also not in the Middle East, and this idea that there's some connection, I guess I would say that so many kind of anti-war organizers and so many sort of independent journalists were smeared for years and years and years as a quote unquote crazy conspiracy theorist for suggesting that perhaps, the so-called quote unquote moderate rebels in Syria, about which your podcast is named, were, in fact, not moderate rebels, but were in fact kind of U.S. proxies linked to, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and whatnot. Also kind of smeared as conspiracy theories for suggesting that there is a lot of reason to doubt many of these so-called chemical weapons attacks that have happened within Syria, that so kind of conveniently aligned to whatever it is the U.S. want to do. So, for instance, the U.S. at any point where they needed to intervene to sort of kind of save the, again, quote unquote, moderate rebels, which were often so connected to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups, whenever those were in danger of being wiped out, there was kind of this mysterious chemical weapons attack, at which point, the U.S. would then bomb Damascus, for instance, blame it without any kind of evidence on the Syrian government. So for so long, anyone who pointed out, even just to sort of raise questions of the inconsistencies of the narrative around chemical weapons attacks and who was using them. Anyone who even brought that up was smeared as a crazy conspiracy theorist, just beyond the pale. But then you have kind of the publications around, these kind of mainstream corporate publications. First of all, just taking the kind of Russiagate, now revealed to be a hoax, completely wholesale, but then publishing this nonsense about Venezuela being either harboring Hezbollah, as we were talking about, or the other one that I keep seeing is that somehow there's a plot by Cuban doctors. There was a just absolutely slanderous article published in the New York Times about supposedly Cuban doctors actually being kind of agents of the Cuban government and whatnot, acting within Venezuela. And it's just the hypocrisy behind that, the fact that when there's a right-wing conspiracy theory, it's so often just bought wholesale by the corporate media. These kind of these kind of like neoliberal aligned right-wing conspiracy theories about independent governments are just bought wholesale by the corporate media with very, very little questioning. But yeah, if you start to raise questions about any of this other stuff we were just talking about, you're the crazy conspiracy theorist. It's just absolute kind of hypocrisy.
Well, of course, and what this reflects is, as I often talk about, how the U.S. corporate media really just carries water for the U.S. government. And this is very clear. We've seen it again and again. The New York Times has never opposed a U.S. war. And when we see these stories, all you have to do is look at the sources. That's one of the first things you should always do as a reader. Who is saying this? Where does this information come from? Because the New York Times and most of these media outlets, not to get rosy about the past and engage in rosy retrospection as if things used to be so much better, because they were very similar, but at least several decades ago, the New York Times used to kind of do on-the-ground reporting, even though it was still biased propaganda. But at this point, they barely even have anyone on the ground anymore. Foreign correspondents barely exist anymore. People just sit in their office and then just get fed press releases and unofficial and official leaks, and then just rewrite them, and then just quote these anonymous U.S. government officials, and then expect us to believe what these anonymous U.S. government officials say. That was the entire Russiagate scandal, which we now know is completely fake, but it was fabricated by all these anonymous officials working in the U.S. government, specifically intelligence agencies. And now we see this again on Venezuela, where you have these anonymous officials claiming this. You mentioned Syria. Yeah, I mean, not even just anonymous U.S. government officials, but in that case, we have a coterie of D.C. think tanks where these think tanks are funded by, if not the U.S. government, they're funded by the arms industry, they're funded by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And then they have these fake experts who don't speak Arabic and have never even been to Syria, who go and get quoted by the Washington Post and say, well, these moderate rebels need our support, so the U.S. has to invade, blah, blah, blah. There's an entire cottage industry built around this, and it's all about manufacturing consent. As it's a cliche, but as Edward Herman and also Noam Chomsky, although Edward Herman's name is often erased, as they wrote in their famous book, Manufacturing Consent, that's what the corporate media does. And we see it on Iran now, where you see media outlets talking about how the U.S. needs to maintain its interests in the region, and how Iran is supposedly being aggressive, even though the U.S. is sending aircraft carriers off of Iran's coast, and we're supposed to believe that it's Iran that's being the aggressor. Imagine if Iran sent aircraft carriers to the Gulf of Mexico. So there's a lot to say there, but that's why I brought up Venezuela, is because they're using the same playbook they used in Iraq, they used in Syria and Libya. Now they're using that same playbook, some of the same tactics on Iran and Venezuela. Fortunately, I don't think it's nearly as effective, just because the Trump administration is just so blatantly, cartoonishly corrupt and ridiculous, because he chose John Bolton, who is an unabashed war hawk and criminal, and because Obama was a very smart imperialist, and he could carry out some of these actions with the kind of illusion of supporting freedom and democracy, whereas no one truly believes that Trump actually is supporting freedom and democracy, which is why it's even more scandalous. I'll add here that we see Democratic Party leaders who are lining up to support the aggression against Iran. And specifically, I'll mention two recent cases. One, I published an article at The Gray Zone, which, as you mentioned, I help run with Max Blumenthal. You can go to thegrayzone.com with an A, the American spelling. And I pointed out a letter that was signed by 400 members of the U.S. Congress this past week, including at least three major Democratic presidential candidates, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Kirsten Gillibrand, among other Democratic Party leaders like Chuck Schumer. They signed this letter calling on Donald Trump to intensify the war on Syria. And for reasons they said why they want Trump to intensify this war, they specifically said that we should do it to, quote, pressure Iran and Russia, and then, quote, pressure Hezbollah, and then also defend Israel and strengthen Israel's qualitative military edge. They didn't make any pretense of supporting the Syrian people. All that propaganda is gone. In the Trump age, there's no more pretending that this is about democracy. It's all just about empire. And of course, this is the same fake anti-Trump resistance that claims to oppose everything that he does, but then they actually want him to wage more war. And then an even more ridiculous case. I mean, that letter was signed by 400 members of the House and the Senate, which is 75% of the legislature. In addition to that, a few days ago this week, the Senate Foreign Services Committee, they had a meeting and they were considering passing a resolution that was introduced by Udall, who is a Democrat who's not really anti-war, but who's, soft and soft on war, but who will sometimes oppose war. And anyway, he introduced this resolution to try to block the Trump administration from launching a war on Iran. And what happened? Two key Democrats, including Bob Menendez, who's the ranking Democratic member of the Senate Foreign Services Committee, he sided with the Republicans against the rest of his caucus, along with Chris Coons, another Democrat. And the two of them prevented this vote that would block Trump from invading Iran. And in return for that, why did these Democrats help Republicans open the door for Trump to wage war on Iran? Well, because these Democrats wanted the Republicans to vote for more sanctions on Syria. So we have Democratic Party leaders who are allying with Republicans in order to expand sanctions on Syria, which have made it impossible for Syria to import medicine and impossible for Syria to import Iranian oil, which has led to huge gas shortages and crippled the Syrian economy. Not only did these Democrats want more sanctions, they prevented any attempt to block Trump from waging war on Iran. So that says everything. Well, the fake anti-Trump resistance, people like Bob Menendez, who spent all day attacking Trump as if he's the only thing bad with our country, they are actually helping him, bending over backward to wage war on Venezuela, Syria, Iran, Nicaragua, and every country in the global south that tries to pursue an independent path and actually have a sovereign, independent government.
That's so kind of telling where we're at, where the Democrats always, and we saw this again in the Bush administration, but here it is on steroids, where the Democrats, as kind of the party of fake resistance, find themselves trying to outflank the Republican Party from the right, be even more kind of the party of the military and the party of imperialism and whatnot. And, here we are. So in our last few minutes, you were in Venezuela a couple months back, actually kind of on the ground there. So I'm wondering if you can kind of just give us a recap of sort of your experiences, what it is you saw, what's kind of the sense on the ground of kind of how things are playing out, where people's kind of loyalties are, and what the actual kind of economic situation is there.
Well, I was in Venezuela for about a month in February and March. and I went with my colleague Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone. And we went because, of course, the US launched this coup attempt on January 23rd, which has failed miserably again and again and again. And when we were there, it was before some of the extremely brutal economic warfare, although it was, I mean, it's just hard to compare because it was extremely brutal before, but like now it's just gotten to the point where it's pure insanity, it's pure sadism. The Trump administration this week is now imposing new sanctions on Venezuela's food program, on their food subsidy program to try to starve Venezuelan civilians. This is a crime against humanity. This is genocidal. The US is trying to starve Venezuelan civilians by preventing the government from giving them subsidized food. Despite these extreme difficulties, I also need to stress that it was not a humanitarian catastrophe. It was not a humanitarian disaster, despite what CNN says again and again and again. Now, there certainly are difficulties, and the US government is the primary culprit for creating those difficulties. But we need to talk about a few different things, and I'll go through methodically here. One, the food situation. When I was there was no shortage of food. And from know a lot of people there, and I've been asking, and from what I've heard, there still is not a shortage of food. Although the U.S. is now trying to make that a reality by imposing sanctions on the food program. Venezuela has this incredible program that you'll never hear about in the Western media called CLAP. This is a food subsidy program where the government basically gives food for free. It's technically not free, but it costs like 3 pennies. It's effectively free. And they give out these boxes and bags of food to families, and not even families, just households. And what's incredible is the government gets all the food together, but then they have volunteers who organize in their own communities to distribute the food to their neighbors. And I went there and I filmed some of these people and interviewed some people. And I had no government handlers. We had one fixer who was Venezuelan who had no link to the government, and I speak Spanish, so like we got by. And I went with an open mind. I mean, I knew there was a lot of propaganda, but I wanted to see reality for myself. And it was even more impressive than I thought it would be, where you had all these Venezuelans, frankly, some of whom are not even Chavistas. In fact, some people from the opposition were also getting food from the government. It's estimated that 6 million families, at least 70% of the Venezuelan population, benefits from this food program that the Trump administration is now trying to stop. So there was that. So the hunger is grossly exaggerated in Venezuela. Now, it's true that there are certain foods that are unaffordable, and that's because it's imported. Things like cheese is very expensive, certain kinds of meat. But the staples, there's a lot of it. There's food everywhere. There are people on the streets in food carts. You can buy arepas, which is common Venezuelan food. There are still people in restaurants and bars. Now, there are economic difficulties, and one of the other reasons that we need to talk about is that the price of oil plummeted. So in addition to the illegal, crippling sanctions that the U.S. has imposed, which effectively amounts to a kind of embargo of Venezuela, just like the embargo of Cuba, in addition to that, the Obama administration in its second term worked with Saudi Arabia to drop the price of oil on the global market. In 2014, they came to an agreement where, in return for the U.S. giving even more support to the so-called Syrian rebels that Saudi Arabia was also supporting, in return for that, including anti-tank missiles, which Saudi Arabia was also sending to these so-called rebels, which ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So in response to that, Saudi Arabia agreed to overpump oil and drop the price of oil on the global market, which hurt the economies of Venezuela, Iran, and Russia. So the Venezuelan economy was really hard hit by that. And then in addition to that, the crippling U.S. sanctions have made things hard. But like I said, there are still people in the streets. There are still a lot of people who support the government. I mean, there are people who don't support the government, of course, but the opposition it certainly exists, but it is not mainstream, and it's extremely unpopular, especially certain figures like Leopoldo Lopez, the kind of extreme right-wing figures. They don't have widespread working class support in Venezuela. They have a base in the eastern rich part of Caracas because this is still a class society. The government was elected the Venezuelan people elected a socialist party to govern, but they never had a socialist actual like overthrow of the capitalist system. They were always working within the confines of parliamentary bourgeois democracy, and they have made many gains, but there still is an elite capitalist class in Venezuela, largely concentrated in the eastern part of Caracas, that goes back and forth to Florida and to Panama, and they are still living comfortable lives. You can see them. I went through these neighborhoods. They have sushi restaurants. They have fun bars. You'll see people dancing at clubs. So the idea that this is a hellscape falling apart is just ridiculous propaganda. Like I said, there are difficulties, but we need to look at why those difficulties exist. And the main reason, not the only reason, but the main reason is because the United States has been waging unremittent economic warfare, relentless economic warfare for years to try to destroy Venezuela. And the Venezuelan people are still fighting back, and it's really made their lives more difficult. But it looks like the Venezuelan government's going to weather the storm, even though, as I said, it's extremely difficult, and it's going to get worse as the sanctions get even worse and more targeted.
I really appreciate that kind of context, and I really appreciate you kind of taking so much time to kind of parse out so many different kind of geopolitical situations as they evolve right now. We're going to have to leave it there. We have been joined by Ben Norton, who is a reporter for the Gray Zone, the producer of Moderate Rebels podcast, which he co-hosts with Max Blumenthal. You can find his work at bennorton.com. He tweets at Benjamin Norton. And yeah, of course, the Gray Zone is a great resource for so many independent journalists who are looking for a more kind of independent and nuanced analysis of global politics outside the corporate media. It's a source I use pretty regularly, as well as the Moderate Rebels podcast. So it's been very great to be joined by you today, Ben. Thank you very much.
Oh, of course. It was my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, man.
So we have a couple minutes left in this episode. For the duration of this episode, I'd like to provide a preview of some of the conversation that we had with Kevin Zeese, the co-director of Popular Resistance, for the Empire Supernova podcast. This is sort of the premium version of this show that features longer, more detailed struggles around geopolitical shifts and whatnot, basically looking at sort of the contraction of the U.S. empire in the sort of age after the war on terrorism as the United States prepares for what it calls a global power conflict between Russia and China. So for the last couple episodes we produced of this, we focused specifically on the Venezuelan embassy in D.C., the U.S. illegal seizure of that. Kevin Zeese, as the co-director of Popular Resistance, was on the ground in the embassy as part of the internationally recognized Embassy Protection Collective from kind of start to finish there, from the moment of the establishment of that collective until the police raid in May. So this is a little bit from Kevin Zeese on Empire Supernova. You can find that show on Patreon at Empire Supernova.
We were actually in Venezuela when the U.S. Venezuela broke diplomatic relations, and Venezuela asked the U.S. diplomats to leave the country. And they did that for a lot of reasons, but they basically found that the U.S. embassy in Venezuela was being used to organize a coup. They sought to undermine the election last May that was held when President Maduro won re-election. They tried to discourage people from running in that election because they knew that Maduro was going to win it because he's popular and has been doing what he can to serve the people. And they tried to discourage candidates from running. They tried to discourage voters from voting. They've been trying to get the military members to switch and join the coup. They recruited Juan Guaido to be the so-called interim president. And so the embassy became not a diplomatic place, but a place for coup plotting and military attacks against Venezuela. So it finally broke, and diplomatic relations ended. And then when we came back to the United States, we learned that the U.S. government had allowed the coup plotters to take over the military attaché building in Washington, D.C., and take over the diplomatic offices at the UN of Venezuela. These coup plotters were able to take that over as well. These are really incredible violations of law, but that's the way the U.S. is when it comes to international law too often. And so the OAS then was manipulated in holding a vote in violation of its rules to recognize Guaido. They were unable to recognize Guaido based on their traditional rules. The Organization of American States is very much under the control of the United States, but they still could not get the 2/3 vote needed to recognize Guaido. So they changed the rules and required just a majority vote, and they barely got that. And the diplomats voting for it looked very solemn when they did. They realized what this meant, how this just made the OAS look like a tool of the United States, and they were part of that tool, and it put them in a position of, will our country be next? But they did it, and they ordered the Venezuelan diplomats to the OAS to leave the United States in 2 weeks. At that point, the next day, we came into the embassy. This is April 10th. And the Embassy Protection Collective began. There were still Venezuelan ambassadors, diplomats, and staff in the embassy for the first 2 weeks. During that time, we held forums every night on a wide range of issues, not just Venezuela, but Honduras, on AFRICOM, on CIA coups. We had John Kiriakou, a former CIA official, speaking about an insider's view of CIA coups from the Venezuelan embassy. Pretty amazing. And so we had like 100 people showing up every night. People started spending the night. We got to the point of something like 70 people sleeping over. The embassy staff building held up to 80 people. So we were even doubling up in rooms for sleeping. It was getting so popular and crowded. But then there was a coup in Venezuela, another attempt by Juan Guaido, where he tried to get the military to switch sides. He tried to go into a military base. The coup was quickly squashed. It was a very poorly planned.
That was a bit from Kevin Zeese, the co-director of Popular Resistance. You can find the rest of that particular interview, that particular discussion on the Venezuelan embassy by going to the Empire Supernova podcast. That is a podcast developed once a month by me, Brian Griffith, to look at the global realignment of U.S. empire in sort of this age of preparing for a global power conflict between Russia and China. We discuss in this episode, the last couple episodes of Empire Supernova, essentially the U.S. seizure of the Venezuelan embassy. It's very interesting stuff, and the first part of that episode with Claire Cook of the Answer Coalition is available in its entirety online for non-subscribers. I hope you enjoyed that discussion. You can find all of the other information at Patreon. Going to Patreon and find, just type in Empire Supernova. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.